Welcome everybody to this Values Jam on the topic of diversity. And I'm fascinated by this topic. There's so much in it, so I'm really excited as to where this conversation is going to go. We have with us Razia, who's going to introduce the topic shortly. Before we do that, what I'd like to do is just share my screen so that I can give you a sense of what the Values Jam vibe is, so that we can kind of tune into that and get the most out of the experience. So in terms of what the Values Jam approach is, let me just show you these slides. So that's what we're talking about, diversity. And what I'd really like us to concentrate on is this slide. And if we could take in turns, please, to read a sentence. If we start from the top left and then work along to the right and then down one line to the left and along to the right again, then we'll be able to keep track of where we're going. I can't see everybody on the screen at the moment, so make it a bit of a free-for-all, but Razia, why don't you start? And then whoever wants to follow with the next sentence, feel free to read that.
Thank you. We shape our judgments and assumptions with the spirit of being in the same band. We treat people as they would like to be treated.
In a values jam, everybody wins. No one likes a lead guitarist hogging the stage for too long.
Tune into what is said, not the person, including with your own words.
The Values Jam is creative, have fun, be playful, anything goes, give it a try.
Kim might be ducking out of this one, I'm not sure, so I'll do be non-judgmental.
We develop the dialogue as one band, resist the temptation of one-to-one discussion.
It isn't necessary that everybody be convinced to have the same view. We value difference over vanilla, except in ice cream.
Be curious for new insights and reflections to help us learn and grow.
We share thoughts and opinions in a positive spirit without hostility.
We practice suspending our assumptions.
Listen, listen, listen to the rhythm developing.
Which one are we on now? We co-create something new together.
Be relaxed.
Each values jammer joins in, flow with the whole meaning of the group, and play your part in finding a way for everyone to join in. No one is left out.
Ask questions to help develop understanding.
Be aware of the subtle fear and pleasure sensations that block our ability to listen freely.
Silence adds value. Speak when you're ready. There's no obligation.
We test traditional thinking and perceptions.
Okay, and the last one, we share those long lost memories or experiences that cross our mind. Okay, so that gives us a feel of how this is going to go. It's, for those of you that have not experienced it, it might feel a little bit strange at the beginning because this is not a conversation. It was described to me as putting your comment into the center of the room. And when you hear a comment, detach it from the person who said it, regard it as being in the center of the room and respond to the comment, not the person. So we'll see how this goes. The big one actually is that silence is okay. So if there is silence, that's fine. Just embrace it and we'll enjoy it for as long as it lasts. I saw a post on, I think it was either LinkedIn or Twitter the other day. It was Twitter. And it was a facilitator who said that her record for silence in a group was 47 minutes.
Hey.
Now, I don't think we're going to get that today, but it just, when I read that, it tickled me. Okay, so we're going to be talking about diversity, and actually the first twist is that in our ValuesJam card deck, there isn't a card diversity, because we had a choice between diversity and inclusion, and we actually went for inclusion. Today, we're going to be looking at diversity. And as I mentioned earlier, Razia is here with us to give us kind of a thought-provoking introduction into the topic before we start our dialogue. So Razia, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much. And it's wonderful to be here today. When I was thinking about this, I thought, how can I speak about it in a sense, not as a diversity professional, because that's something I've probably been doing for 30 years, quite unexpectedly, like not, and there was no career plan. It just happened. I was supposed to be a singer somehow, but I became a diversity consultant. There you go. But something that so I thought, well, what is it really to me? And so I'm starting there. And ever since I can remember, since I was a child, I've always been interested in those really big questions, like, where did I come from and where am I going? That is, before this life and after this life. And in between those two end markers, what on earth happens here? And that's the way that I think about diversity and feel about diversity, which is that everything is about the journey in this life. And in between those those kind of end markers, there is this, what's my task while I'm here? When I think about that, and I think about us, we get born without a conscious choice. I mean, if you believe in reincarnation and all of that, it's fine, but we don't have a conscious choice about which parents we're born to, which family we're born into, what time in the planet and the planet's history, what neighborhood, what class, what color skin, what biology, whether we're impaired or not impaired, what our genes are. We don't have a choice in any of this, consciously at least. We come into the world and we tumble in a particular bundle, find ourselves in a particular place, and we have to make our way. Now, everything that I've just spoken about, which is about family, neighborhood, nation, biology, genes, all of these things, they're all the stuff of diversity, right? They're the stuff that actually has a huge influence on our life chances, and we don't have control over any of it. So this is where I'm starting with diversity, that there are these forces, structural forces, historical forces and societal forces, totally outside the control of any individual, which have a very strong bearing on the life chances that you face coming into the world as a little human organism. And another set of cells somewhere else, maybe just half a mile away, has a totally different set of life chances, maybe even in the next house. So maybe even in the same family, by virtue of different biology or a different point in the family's life cycle when you happen to be born. So diversity is absolutely core to our experience of life. And although we don't determine individually any of the things that produce these vast differences in life chances, and they've been recorded, you know, through research and you know, sociological research, that there is something that we do have sovereignty over, and that's what we do with what we've got. And so these two things, each of one of us is strongly influenced by forces beyond our control, but what we make of the chances that we actually have, that's really ours. And so there's something about the spiritual journey, if you like, of life, which means encountering these questions of diversity living in the skin, in the body, in the family, in the country, in the class that you happen to have been born into. Maybe you'll be moving out of that, but you're navigating that all the time. Nobody can escape that. So diversity is at the very heart of our life as humans, and we all have to navigate it because we're social animals. And I often say to people, humans are not polar bears. You know, polar bears don't live in family groups. The mothers sometimes they'll have the cubs, but the cubs will grow up and they'll go away. And there's no sense of a group culture. They don't sit around a fire and share stories and pass them down to their young. But humans do that, and we've done that for hundreds of thousands of years. We pass down culture. And in that culture are riches, but every culture has hierarchies, and every culture has barriers for certain types of people. Those may vary over time and over geography, but we will be inserted into the human story somewhere at a certain point in history, in a certain place in time, and in a certain body. And that's why diversity is absolutely core to what we do. And the question is, if we do enjoy certain influence, certain power, certain privileges within that system, which we didn't personally create, what do we do with that? If we experience certain injuries, certain wounding, certain barriers, certain insults, certain violence because of who we happen to be, what do we do with that? And for me, that's the spiritual journey of the human soul. That is soul. Soul is maybe not the right word, but it's our journey of unfolding. Is like how we do what we do with the riches or the wealth that we have, and what we do with the challenges that we encounter. So I see diversity also as a schoolroom. It's a place where we learn what it is to be human and how best to be human. And of course, it brings out how worse to be human as well. And we see that both in the workplace, and we see that obviously on the battlefield, and we see that on our television screens every day. So nothing could be more central to who we are, and nothing could be, in a sense, more important for us to collectively work on, as a species. I'm going to stop there because I think I've probably spoken for more than 5 minutes, and there's a lot more that I could say, but that's probably good enough for now.
Thank you, Razia. And I'm feeling like we've got a bucket of stuff that we were considering at the beginning, and you've just ripped the lid off. It just feels like you've just gone like that. So a fantastic start. And with ValuesJam, the first question on the card is always the same. And that's what we're going to start with today. So bear in mind what you just heard from Razia. Remember, don't feel pressure to respond to this question immediately. Just think on it for a while. When you're forming your first thoughts, just consider them to begin with, rather than say them immediately. And then when anybody's ready to speak, feel free to do that. So the question is, what does diversity mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
I'll go. When I think of diversity, what does it mean to me? It means to me like people from different backgrounds, cultures, faiths, different colours, just having different, the way they've been brought up, they'll have different values and beliefs. being different from each other. Sound like, when you asked that question, the first thing that came to me was when I was a teenager. My dad, when he used to be driving on the motorway, he'd get a lot of racist drivers. Yeah, I just remember that a lot. When you said sound like and opening the window and being racist towards my dad. I know a number of times, like, they would follow us on exits, and a couple of times my dad would take a different exit just to get away from the drivers. And this is like in the 90s. That's my input.
Thanks, Asma. I'll fill in for Kim because she's on the train. In the chat, she said that for her, diversity is all about differences and uniqueness, or uniquenesses. Is that a word?
You know what? I didn't think it was a word, and it came up in spelling, so I stuck it
It
there.
is now.
Well, it is now anyway.
Yeah.
And I am on a train. I'm just getting into my stuff. But yeah, for me, it's like differences and uniquenesses. Because there's no one person, no matter who they are, where they are, where they've come from, that are exactly the same. And for me, it provides a richness to a group because of those differences and uniquenesses. Although I want confirmation that that's a word before I use it ever again. And I think why Alan thought it would be such a good thing for me to be here today is because I champion the inclusion card for ValuesJam. And I guess for me, I don't think we can have diversity without there for right now while I leave the train, and I'll pick you guys up on my walk home.
Thanks, Kim.
For me, it's being able to recognise people's individual differences. Pretty much what everybody else has said, you know, like everybody's unique in their own way. We've all got differences and they're all brilliant in their own way. It feels like, for me, it feels like, you know, the feeling you get because you're included, everybody's included, and that it makes you feel good, doesn't it? Being included. So yeah, that's all I've got.
When I thought of it, I thought about how it makes me feel when I see difference in the room, and it makes me feel safer, and it makes me feel, it just fills my heart with joy when I see difference. So, for example, if I watch a program and it's a drama and they've got different people with different colored skin and different backgrounds, and I can see that difference and it's really obvious, it makes me feel alive, and it makes me feel safe, and it makes me feel happy.
I share some of the thoughts that others have said as well about how it's, you know, all of this variety. But actually what Kelly was saying made me think that I think that sometimes diversity gets in the way of us realizing the similarities. And sometimes perhaps we're encouraged to look a bit too much at the diversity rather than what we have in common, actually. And then there's something also about diversity, which is in a way a contradiction, because on the one hand, it's kind of this richness, but at the same time, it seems to me that it is also providing the grounds for some tension, actually. But that need not be regarded as a negative thing, that some tension because of difference could be accepted, celebrated, rather than regarded as something to worry about.
Mm.
So those are just some initial thoughts.
When I was thinking about your question, Alan, what came up actually was a little section of the soundscape that I've just produced, which because we are all different, but one of the things we have in common is this distinctiveness of our being. So like, you look at everybody in this room, there's never been another life exactly the same as mine or yours. And actually that we share as a common thing. So I thought about this little section of my soundscape, because what I have from the idea from something called Space for Peace, which has been produced by a colleague of mine. She has people singing in Winchester Cathedral, well, it was in Winchester Cathedral, not anymore, different chants from and recitations from their different faith traditions, but they're all doing it at the same time in different parts of the cathedral. So as you walk around, you have this discordant, sometimes harmonious, sometimes coming in, going out. You have the beauty of this diversity where everybody is being completely authentic to who they really are. And the sound, the symphony that is produced, is something uniquely human. So when I was doing this piece of work, it's because it's based upon, I won't give you a lot of background to it, but it's based upon the World War I Indian soldiers who died serving the British. And this particular section has got the chants of 4 spiritual traditions all on top of each other, like you would hear it in any village or town in India as you're walking down the street. And that richness, that ability to be with each other in our authenticity isn't neat. And there can be tensions, you know, people are in different keys, they're singing at different paces, somebody's loud, someone's soft. But the authenticity of the faithful heart is the same, whichever faith tradition that faithful person is singing in. So you can feel that vibration that's beyond words when you immerse yourself in that sound. And often sound rather than words is more helpful, because words tend to divide the world up in very conceptual ways, whereas sound just passes through the body and moves you. And maybe there's something about if we can learn to accept each other in that way, rather than always judging. There's always a narrative, there's a judgment, there's a concept, there's a, I like this, I don't like that. A little bit like the ValuesJam statements at the beginning. So to detach a bit from I like this, I don't like that, and be curious, what's happening here? What's happening in me? How is this person or this sound or this contribution changing me?
Mm-hmm. Asma, I'm feeling that I wish Lisa was here. So Lisa is the co-founder of ValuesJam, the card game. And she's big on harmony. And she's got a fascinating definition, or I found it fascinating the first time I heard it, because it was kind of just a bit different than I had been thinking about harmony up until that point. And I'll just read from her quote. So she says, strong harmonies are made from different voices working together. So before I heard Lisa's view of it, you know, I always thought that harmony was kind of the end result. It was something nice to listen to. But actually her point is that it's this combination of difference, and that's the real joy of harmony.
Mm.
So let's move forward then, and let's just look at our own life experience, and let's start with what I think is probably the easier of the two sides of the coin. So the question is, where have you noticed a lack of diversity?
Sorry, I'm bursting with this one. I was going to say nearly everywhere I go, but actually what I really want to say is nearly everywhere where important decisions are made that affect masses of people.
That's an amazing answer, because yeah, you're right, aren't you? I'm just thinking of, I haven't been to Hackney Marshes to watch the football, but I bet there's loads of diversity there. But it's not a place where important decisions are made that affect loads of people.
That's right.
And so why is it that there's loads of diversity? You know, if you go to a music concert, well, some music concerts, there will be loads of diversity. But like you say, not in the important places.
And
But I
adding
suppose-
to that,
Sorry.
in terms of not in the, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kip, it's all right.
Kim, when you've got your chance, get in there, please, because I know that you're either walking or it's not so easy. So please, let's hear what you're thinking. Louisa, you're going to have to get in there while Kim's getting it sorted out.
I think I've forgotten what I was going to say. I think it was about linked to the music, because I think I was going to say it depends, because there is, Razia said importance, but then, you know, when people get together to raise money and music is involved, you know, like to feed those who are hungry in parts of the globe where, you know, children are dying and there is no water. When I've experienced those campaigns where there's a music track that comes out and then all of the celebrities come together to support it and everybody across the world starts putting money in, then that's also important, and it can bring people together. So when you have music, that seems to be a really good way, that a good medium that brings diversity together, regardless of where you come from and what your background is. And the cause is when it's, you know, something like hunger and feeding children, that's important, and that's a good way that you do see diversity.
I think the thing about important is that I was talking about important decisions rather than important situations. Everything we do can be important, even the smallest thing of remembering that you haven't seen your neighbour for a few days and knocking on their door to see if they're okay. Now that's important. But my point was about the lack of diversity in decision-making places, where the decisions are going to affect mainly not the people who are making the decisions, but millions of other people.
Yeah, that's so true.
I think when you said that, go on, Kim.
No, I was just going to say, following on that, you know, in today's work environment and just in life in general, we are all talking about diversity, and yet getting back to the decision makers, it seems like the decision makers are the ones that want the least diverse perspectives in making those important decisions. And it is absolutely shocking.
Idea.
Asma, what were you going to say?
When Razia said that, I thought of the same thing, and I thought of, because I'm part of this panel where with the NHS, where they're actually talking about diversity and inclusion. There's lack of it. As in to say, in the higher roles. And where I've also seen it, like my brain's all over the place actually with lots of different ideas, but with the kind of work that I do, I work with people that have been abused, and what I've seen is there's lack of diversity there because a lot of women of colour are treated and labelled as a victim when they go for help in the courts. And if they try to speak up or have a voice, they're treated as being hostile. If they want to voice their concerns, or that they're the problem. And I know there's a big campaign going on in London with a women's organisation, but that's a big one for me, where I've seen that as well. Lack of diversity. Sorry, I feel like my things are all like negative at the moment, but yeah.
I'm going to throw a curveball here, I think. So I think this is born out of, well, it's kind of building on what Asma's just touched on. And it's what I see as kind of misguided diversity intention in organizations. And the example of lack of diversity I'll give is a typical corporate women's network group. So what happens, it seems, and I've experienced this in a number of different organizations, the senior people say, oh, we need to have better representation from women. So how are we going to do that? Somebody says, why don't we set up a women's network group? Yeah, that'll do the trick. Let's do that. Let's make somebody senior a sponsor, but then we'll appoint somebody to do all of the work. And what does that look like? Well, it's an event calendar, and it's inviting women to come along to talk to this women's network group. And then when the women's network group get together, they complain about the way they're treated by the men in the organization. And the men in the organization complain that there's a women's network group, and why is it that they've got that and we've got nothing for us? And they don't actually invite us to it either. And so this intention to create something positive around diversity ends up actually being a wall, or can, you know, I'm exaggerating to make a point and have a bit of fun here. But that's where I have seen a lack of diversity, where people get lost in the initiative and forget the reason that the initiative was put in place in the first place.
Well, I've put a little comment in the chat there. Because there's almost always a men's network in the organization. It's called the leadership of the organization.
Yeah.
That's the white men's network, actually, usually the white middle class non-disabled men's network, usually. It's just not yet been named.
Mm.
So when you said people say we haven't got enough women in leadership, that's a male-dominated leadership team saying we need to do something. They've read McKinsey or something, decided that, you know, diversity multiplies ability or whatever it is. And they forget that that's because the men's network is the leadership of the organization.
Mm.
Few women are honorary members.
Mm.
And they're usually white women.
We've got Kim in stereo now. Look, we've got Kim maybe.
Yeah,
maybe on
there's a lovely picture of Kim as well.
I realized I had to go downstairs and grab something. So I am gonna drop off my phone right now and join you guys.
Great.
Wonderful.
And Kelly, where have you seen a lack of diversity?
Well, I see it in little short bits everywhere, really. You know, like this lack of diversity in some schools. I'm not saying all schools, but some schools, businesses, fashion, you know.
Hmm. You made it. So let's so we'll take Kim's arrival to switch to the more positive side of this coin then. So let's hear some examples of where you've seen brilliant examples of diversity.
Well, ironically, having come from the States 12 years ago, I thought that about London when I first got here. Because I think my first tube ride into the city, nobody was speaking English. And I thought, ooh, this is awesome. Like I felt like I was in such a diverse, cosmopolitan, global place. But you also have to understand coming from the US, which is so very US centric. That's what I looked at, you know, London as being incredibly diverse. Of course, that was 12 years ago. And certainly things have come to light, which make me think that, well, maybe London might be, but, you know, certainly that's not necessarily the case throughout all of the UK. So, you know, for me, it was a learning experience in terms of being here. And, you know, now I've learned even more about London. And so perhaps it might be the case, but it goes to that inclusivity as well.
Mm.
And the belonging.
Mm. Mm.
So I'm sorry, Alan, I'm not sure if that was a positive comment, but it certainly was meant to be, because that was my, you know, perspective initially.
Yeah, for me, Kim, I think London is a brilliant example. And I always, whenever I think about London, I think about it being really diverse. But this brings me back to, I think I've got a bit of a bugbear with the word diversity, actually, because just because there's a bunch of people that are different in a place doesn't necessarily mean that that's for the good. Because unless those people have a voice, then what's the point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. Diversity without equity doesn't make sense.
Mm. And I think there are lots of places where you can find that diversity. So when you think about the pandemic that we've been through, all of the people that had to go out and had to go to work, they were the people who were doing the roles that a lot of people consider as critical. And yet, as Razia said earlier, those people, they're not the people that make the decisions about what happens for them in those roles. They're the people who do the roles, like the bus drivers and the nurses and the taxi drivers and the cleaners and the street cleaners and all of those people. That you see diversity there, but those are the people that are, like Razia said, the equity. They don't have all of the stuff that you'd like those diverse people to have in their lives, the opportunities, the fortune, the money, all of the ability to be able to stay at home and work like many of us had the opportunity to do. So like you say, without, you can have the diversity, but as you said, Alan, without the inclusion and the equity, there's people lose out. It's a penalty, if you like.
Absolutely. I think that's a great example, Louisa, because I was thinking about hospitals, both in COVID and in relation to MRSA, that actually cleaners are so pivotal. And when they're not listened to and actually not valued, you could lose the executive team of a hospital and nothing would change, really. You wouldn't notice they'd gone. But if the cleaners tomorrow were not there, the hospital couldn't function. And it's not just their pay packets that don't reflect that, just their working conditions and the way they're treated and talked to and talked down to in that hierarchy. So this actually shows that not just diversity. I mean, diversity is essential to all living systems. No living system can thrive without diversity. Monocultural living systems die. But it's not just diversity in human systems, it's also inclusion and equity that are important, because without that, actually that's what's leading us to the brink of disaster, is our unequal human systems are actually creating both the climate crisis and the species extinction crises, because of the concentration of power and money and decision making in the hands of very, very few people who are all quite similar to each other. And actually, where that doesn't happen, you see something beautiful happening. And the thing that I went to immediately when you said diversity, really beautiful example of diversity, is when I was growing up. I come from a South Asian family. I've got family in Pakistan, family in India. And we have in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent a syncretic spiritual tradition of music, which draws people from every faith and every religion in an appreciation of this kind of creed of universal love. And so that's not supposed to happen. Sorry about that. And I've got a new phone and I don't know how to. And when I was a child, my father used to hold these musical programs in our house, and our Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Christian friends, Bengali, Punjabi, Gujarati, Urdu speaking, Hindi speaking, they'd all come to our house. And because we all have different kind of prohibitions and stuff, we'd always know you have to have vegetarian food for the Brahmins, and you have to have this, and everybody would know not to bring alcohol to our house because we're a Muslim household. So we have this deep inbuilt both understanding and respect for each other's traditions, but we're also united across these differences by this amazing music, because these wandering saints who used to kind of wander around, and maybe sometimes still do, they have a following from every possible tradition, and then everybody's just carried away by the music, right? And we stop at midnight and eat, and then we go on until 4 a.m. And this kind of culture, it's actually dying out. Certainly in this country, you don't find that kind of interreligious mixing in that sort of way that we used to have then. But that was my foundation. That was me understanding that diversity is not only a good thing, but it's a group experience, because as humans, we do not exist as islands. We need each other. We rely on each other. And yet there is this common aspiration to happiness, to love, to connecting with people. And this kind of music enabled that to happen, which is why it still drives me. Which is why I just think beyond words and beyond our concepts about things, and even words like diversity and equity and all of that, there is a human experience of being in our distinctions together in a state of acceptance and welcoming of each other. And I don't experience that very often, not often enough.
I think there's loads of people who don't experience it ever, Razia.
Yeah, and that's the tragedy, because
yeah,
the wonders we can bring about when we are able to just allow each other in and respect the ways in which people are different, are unlimited, actually.
And Razia, I wanted to ask you about the term when you use equity, because I used that once talking about needing that equity, and somebody jumped down my throat and was like, everybody's equity is different. And I was like, no, I think that's equality. If you're talking about
See what happens with words?
That's the thing. She jumped down my throat and I haven't used it since.
Yes.
So like hearing you say that, I was like, oh, maybe, maybe I wasn't so far off after all.
Well, I think that, you've just pointed to something so important. There's this really toxic thing in the world of Edie and I,
yeah,
which is the kind of waving of banners with particular words, and then aligning with a particular underlying paradigm because of the words you're using. Now, I understand why that happens, but that's not the real deal. Humans don't experience the best of each other through aligning to particular language or a particular set of concepts. The experience we can have with each other is very, very rich and way beyond that. I'm not discounting language, by the way. I think language is terribly important. But if we're going to get to know each other better, we need to kind of dance together, eat together, sing together, sit around a fire together, pray together in our different ways, or meditate, or whatever it is we do, and walk in forests together and connect with nature and dig the soil together. That's actually where real experiences of human connection happen, not in the intellect of getting it right about diversity. One of our biggest enemies is everybody in the field of equity, equality, diversity, inclusion, social justice, whatever you want to call it, has to be right. And that need to be right is going to make somebody wrong, which is exactly what you experienced.
Yeah.
So for me, the thing to do when somebody does that is find a way of coming down that ladder rather than going back up it. It's coming down and finding a point of connection, because they've obviously been triggered by something. It's nothing to do with you. It's not personal. There's some like past experience that's biting at their heels, that's upset them. And if you could somehow get under the skin of that, rather than feeling, oh, now I need to use the right words, because that puts you in a hypervigilant state. That's also not the best state for you to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I find religion to be just astronomically divisive. Interestingly, that diversity that I first felt, coming here to London, when it came to this whole idea of like Northern Ireland and the UK and Catholics and Protestants and Henry VIII, and like I was baffled, because coming from the US, like, there were different religions, but like Catholics and Protestants, I always were like, oh, they're the same. And then, you know, you kind of go on from there, other than priests can't get married, but they used to be able to until the church wanted to keep all the land. But, you know, like I find religion to be such a divisive situation, when really, is there any right or wrong? Like, nobody can, one group can't all be right and everybody else be wrong. Like, I feel like there's too much, as you just said, you know, if you're right, somebody else has to be wrong.
Mhm.
And I find religion to be deeply seated in that fallacy.
Mm.
That's why
Yeah.
that music example that Razzie gave was just so powerful, because
Brilliant. Yeah.
just think of that as a metaphor for other stuff, because it's making me think the reason that we have the issues between certain groups with their labels is because there's not enough happening to identify that music or equivalent that brings everybody together.
Yeah. And didn't we just see where Ramadan and Passover and Easter all came at
Yeah.
the same time? And what did it do? It was supposed to bring people together, and it created more divisiveness, at least in some areas of the world, which is just, yeah, really sad.
The thing about religion is it inspires the devotion of people, and therefore it's the richest ground for manipulation by those with wealth and power. It's not the religion itself. It's not the aspiration of the faithful to approach their divine or their God or their nirvana. That's not the problem. The problem is, because it's so deeply felt, people are very vulnerable to being manipulated by the powers that be, whoever they might be at a particular time. Could be Henry VIII.
Yeah.
It could be a particular church or a particular orthodoxy. Because religion deals with the thing I was talking about right at the beginning, which is what happens before we come into the world and what happens after we die. It also has inherent in it a huge amount of potential for frightening people. Because if you think you're going to burn in hell forever, if you have a relationship with the person you love, that's a lot of fear to live with, right? So it's unscrupulous leaders who use that kind of fear to manipulate people to do what they want them to. That's not the fault of the religion itself, or if there's such a thing as a religion itself, but it's not the fault of, say, the founder of a religion or a scripture that happens. That's our human failing, our lust for power and greed and money and land.
It's something to do with interpretation as well of a lot of things that's written down. It's people's interpretation of it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you look at any of the religious books, and you know what? I mean, maybe it's just me because I don't know enough about religion, but I didn't see, you know, anything coming from the heavens above and putting the words on the page. It's all interpretation. Okay, I know in the 10 Commandments, when they show that the commandments, you know, with the tablets come down and it's written, but yeah, I mean, it's all interpretation.
And like Razzie was saying, it's that willful, not with intention interpretation that is so dangerous. And I'm not naturally, I'm an optimist by nature, but actually Razia. You've just made me feel really pessimistic, actually.
I'm so sorry.
'Cause I was thinking, yeah, that's right. And what conditions would be needed for people not to feel that they had to manipulate other people and acquire power and wealth?
Mm.
What would need to be in place for that?
They'd have to realize it wasn't in their interests to harm others in order to acquire power and wealth. And most people don't realize that. It actually seems to be in their interest. But if we think about, that's why I like to think about the journey of the consciousness. I prefer consciousness to self, because this is something we have in common as humans. We have this incredible capacity for depth of understanding, both of ourselves and others, and of the world that we live in. And we have this insatiable desire to know, to find truth, to understand. And because we have that in common, we also have in common the tendency to fall asleep and to stop being hungry for truth. And we settle for easier things like money and control over people, power. It's probably because we're afraid to die. I mean, in the bottom of it all, we think we get what we can while we're here, because it's a bit uncertain what happens afterwards. And I do think that's it's an existential problem for us, because to actually evolve out of this, we need to see there's a Sufi teacher whose teachings I used to follow, and I still respect. And he said, don't say of your friend, I love him, he's my friend. Say, I love him, he's myself. Because actually we're so dependent on each other for knowing even who we are, that we should never look at another person and say, oh, I ought to do something for them. We should be looking at the other person saying, if I help them, I'm helping myself. Because we can't do without each other. And I think the fear of death and the fear of, well, as the Buddha said, old age, sickness, birth, old age, sickness, and death, the fear of that actually puts us into, there's a lot of, sorry, I'm ranging around a bit here, but there's a lot of research at the moment to something called polyvagal theory, but certainly the issue of how we go into different nervous system states. And fear puts us in a nervous system state that is either hypervigilant or, like an animal that goes into acting dead. So we go either into this hypervigilant where we're constantly like, we can almost be chronically hypervigilant all the time. And in that state, in that triggered state, we actually often forget to reach out to others, to be empathic, to care about what happens to somebody else, to humanize them, to look at it from another perspective. We forget all of that because we draw in and we start thinking about me, and maybe mine, my family, my nation, my thing, my football team. And we just draw in and we disconnect. So we then start, that's in a sense the neurological basis of what happens for us. And if that happens in a group sense, you can make people imagine all sorts of things, like the Russian administration is feeding their whole country this story that the Ukrainians were a threat to Russia, which seems to be totally insane. I don't think that's just Western propaganda, but people will believe a story if they're fearful enough.
Sort of like what happened with COVID, initially when the initial reaction was that, oh my God, this is a worldwide problem. We need to work on it together.
Yes.
And then that fear starts and it all of a sudden it starts splintering out. Now you would think that a pandemic like that would have brought people together.
Well, it brought people together, but not always the powerful or the nations or the
ones that made the decisions again. And I have to go back to what you were saying, in terms of it triggered a state in which we reached out to others that were in our group,
Mhm.
but not the world, like
Yes.
not the wider others.
Well, actually, there was a really
And-
interesting program on the radio. A scientist from, I think she was from Canada, who had worked both with the UK government and the Scottish government throughout the whole pandemic. So she was an expert in, I think, epidemiology. Anyway, she was saying that one of the problems the UK government had, interestingly, the Scottish government didn't have the same level of difficulty, but the UK government had, is that they had been so used to thinking of themselves as exporting expertise to the rest of the world, that when it came to the pandemic, and there were many countries of the global south that were doing better than Britain in dealing with the pandemic, they refused to pay any attention to what anybody else was doing. And it's one of the reasons why that they made such poor and
decisions,
catastrophic decisions that cost so many lives. And she couldn't get a message through to Boris Johnson.
Oh, that's shocking.
So, but this is diversity, right? This is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That actually, if you put the best minds together, as maybe many of the drug companies were able to do to produce these amazing vaccines, they're not perfect, but they've made a huge difference.
Yeah.
Death rate. If you can put people together who think, you know, in different and imaginative and out of the box kind of ways, you get great solutions. Politicians weren't doing that, I'm afraid.
No.
Somewhere, in some parts of the world they were, not here.
Whilst you were talking, Raz, I was thinking about the word identity, because when you think about diversity and bringing diversity together, and when you get everybody in flow and everybody sure of who they are and they feel confident, that's when you start to see things changing and moving, is when you get that difference all connected together. And you talked about consciousness, that consciousness level starts to rise. Yes. And then you start to see the power of things being created, and different thoughts and different directions, and amazing things start to happen then, I think.
Yes. Yes.
But not to bang on about this book that I read over the weekend, Alan, again, which was the what was it? The 5 dysfunctions of teams.
Yeah.
I have it in my bag down there. The basis of that is trust, right?
I was looking at that just the other day, actually, the pyramid, where it shows the bit, yeah.
And the basis is trust in any of those teams. And, you know, taking that diversity and putting it together to connect one another, that still has to have the basis of trust to be able to, you know, create and innovate and bring, you know, the power to that group. Yeah. And, you know, you look at what happened during COVID, is like initially that trust was there, but then it started to erode. And, you know, how could the scientists and the politicians, was there any way to keep that trust?
I don't know if it was, or everybody had that trust to start with, to be honest, Kim. Not in the
maybe
UK.
Not.
There was large groups of people who didn't trust the government at all.
Yeah. And the thing about trust is based in an emotion. And it's based in even more fundamental than that. It's based in a nervous system state, which is regulated, properly regulated. Now, our nervous system doesn't respond to the intellect, it responds to the signals that it receives through the body. So it's mostly unconscious signals that either produce trust or mistrust. So when somebody walks into the room and you feel uncomfortable, they haven't even said anything yet, you're minded not to trust them. You've got no intellectual reason not to trust them. or they speak with a certain accent, or there's all sorts of things like their body language, like whether they're looking at you or not, what the little muscles are doing around their eyes. These things we read unconsciously, and that's actually what starts to produce trust. And when people are in a regulated state, a regulated nervous system state, they tend to induce trust in others. The thing is that almost none of our leaders are properly regulated. They're dysregulated most of the time, and you can tell by the way they behave. You tell how they behave in Parliament. I mean, they're totally dysregulated. They're not in a place of, good self-confidence, no need to put somebody else down, interested, curious, open to the possibility that there might be a different solution than the one that they had thought of, not attached to anything, and not too fearful, maybe a bit excited about trying to do something with other people. They're not operating in that space. So
that's a really, really good description of the politicians in government today. That's really great, that whole regulated state piece.
I think I see that in maybe Biden, I think is probably the closest where I see somebody who is quite clear about who they are, and possibly, that's my thinking.
I was going to Jacinda Ardern, but personally, because she stayed she stayed so calm through, and a little bit Angela Merkel as well. These people who've stayed really steady, and they're not so reactive. They're not having to put somebody down all the time. They're not having to say how great they are. They're not having to kind of go through life on slogans, this kind of thing that happens. We don't throw up leaders who, in this part of the world anyway, who are regulated, who inspire that kind of openness and confidence in others. And maybe when we start to have such people, the press or media tends to destroy them, or something happens that destroys there. But we can do it in small ways ourselves by monitoring our own state. And when you're working as Louisa and I do, I don't know what you do for a living, Kim, but Louisa works with my company sometimes. And when you're working in the training room or in the workshop, doing work on diversity where people are going to get really triggered, you really need to stay in a regulated state, because if you go into dysregulation, the whole thing falls apart.
Oh, yeah.
Razi, I wanted to ask you, you were talking earlier about trust, and you gave the example of when somebody comes into the room and all that sort of stuff. I saw a talk recently, and it was explaining how it was an American guy, I think it might have been Simon Sinek actually, who's not American. But anyway, what he was saying is, what it's like. You're an American in Paris on vacation, and you're out for a meal, and on the table next to you, you're kind of noticing that it's an American accent. And all of a sudden, you're best buddies because you're both American.
You wouldn't have looked at each other back home.
Yeah, and so that happens, right? Similarly in football, it's like, oh, you've got a Manchester United scarf on. I'm a Manchester United supporter. We're best buddies. Now, the opposite of that is that you push people who are different away. And I'm just wondering whether, when you were talking about the neuroscience just now, whether there's anything about that. And I'm thinking, this is another crazy example that's just come to mind. It's Martians arriving on Earth, and our response is to kill them, right? Because we're scared, they're different, we don't know what they are, rather than being curious.
Yeah. We have to cultivate curious, appreciative, open. And also cultures are very different. I found, for example, when I went to Canada, that it seemed to me in the limited experience I had there, The people's default position was to be interested and curious about new people, about strangers, actually want to get to know them, go towards them.
Yeah.
In this country, it's the exact opposite. You know, and I had that firsthand experience when I moved here when I was 6 years old. It was one of the most unpleasant sort of marking experiences of my life. Coming to a country where not only did people not want to know you, their whole body language was so negative. And I mean, you sort of talk about London, but that, for me, arriving in London at the age of 6 was not a friendly experience. So I don't think we have to be that way. We don't have to kill the Martians. We could go, all right, we're a little bit vigilant because we're not quite sure who and what they are. We've never seen anything like this before, but we're also fascinated. And, you know, maybe there's a chance of something new happening here that we might be really interested in. And to cultivate that seems to me, and one of the problems with the way that equality and diversity have been dealt with is that there's been a sort of right, wrong, thought police attitude.
Yeah.
I don't think that's actually come out of the movements for social justice that are behind equality and diversity. I think that's come out of the institutionalization of equality and diversity into something that can be done and controlled. So therefore, there must be a right and wrong way of doing it. And that's produced a lot of fear in people. And also guilt about knowing that inequality exists produces a lot of fear in people. It's projected. So this question of that kills the desire to be curious and open and interested in people who are different from you. Yeah. And actually, what's the whole point of ED&I if actually what it does is stop people talking to each other?
Yeah. And actually, it picks up on what you were saying earlier as well about, you were talking about searching for the truth. And I just wonder whether there's too much obsession with the truth, whatever that is.
Yes.
Whereas in fact, we would be better occupying ourselves in the curious state, almost to the extent of accepting that we might never discover the truth. And it's the same with our obsession with answers rather than asking another question, when it's actually the questions that are often far more interesting than going straight to the answer, which might be right for a short period of time or a long period of time, but we don't know. So it's, I think what's coming through here for me is this inadequacy of the right and wrong piece. And instead us being more comfortable with not knowing.
I think that's true. The danger with that is that social and political inequality really exists. Like people really experience it.
Yeah.
And without needing to be right, what I think people who've experienced historical and generational exclusion need is for those who haven't to accept that that is true.
Yeah.
And I do think that there are always ways of gliding over that uncomfortable reality, because it's so uncomfortable to think that I've got all kinds of unearned privileges, which actually are really quite exceptional. And they may be the norm for me, but they're not the norm for the vast majority of the human race, actually. And that in my comfort, do I really want to be bothered about the fact that there's loads of people who don't have, you know, food on the table or the freedom to walk down the street without being harassed, or, you know, these sorts of things. And my discomfort with the reality of that, plus my guilt at knowing I don't really want to deal with it because my life's perfectly comfortable enough, thank you very much, that I project that onto others and say, oh, you know, there is no truth. That's really convenient, right?
Well, what about this MP over the last couple of days, right? Talking about food banks. And people don't need food banks. They need to be able to cook.
Yeah. That's what you said,
I'm
wasn't
like,
it?
what? Now, I have a question for you guys, though. Does he really believe that? Like, this is the thing. When I hear things like that,
Yeah.
and I know they're all over the place. I mean, like, do these people really believe what they're saying deep down? Or, like you said, they don't want to be bothered by it. The discomfort of dealing with it will, you know.
The other one, Kim, was in the last couple of days. I don't know if you saw this one. It was a photograph. I think it was Southend, and it was the Conservative councillors opening a new food bank, and they were all delighted.
Yeah, how wonderful.
I mean, just like
It might as well be an 1875 from
Mm.
2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So we're proud. Yeah.
We're proud we've got poor people who can't afford to buy their own shopping.
And that we're good enough to feed them.
Yeah, we're good
Yeah.
enough to feed them.
ooh, yes.
So do you see, this is one of the problems with saying there is no truth, because actually, I'm going to have to take that.
Yeah,
Can
go
you
on.
give me a moment? I'll be back.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
But that was a very interesting part to stop on. And that is really, really interesting. How, you know, that inequality isn't manifested in something humble, but in ego,
Mm.
you know?
I think it also shows that we are, through that inequality, it's like living in a different universe. There's this paradigm between those people who have a completely different world and life that's just so unlike the person who's got the last tin of beans in their cupboard, and they're now in this food bank because they haven't got any sugar, they haven't got any milk, they haven't got anything, you know, to feed themselves with, and now they can't pay their electricity bill either.
And it is kind of shocking about, you know, how we just had the what's it called when they go and read the Queen's speech? Or
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not really British. What is it called?
The Queen's speech.
It's just the Queen's speech.
Oh, is that it? The
That's
Queen's
what it-
speech,
yeah,
right?
that's
The
what it
Queen's speech, yes.
Which always baffled me. And again, it probably is because I'm American, but it baffles me that if it's the Queen's speech, but yet the politicians wrote it, I almost feel like Prince Charles would have been rolling his eyes thinking, what a bunch of crap that they're talking about, where he couldn't actually say that. But I wonder if Queen Elizabeth thinks the same thing, like what a bunch of crap they're talking about, and how she gets herself to stand up there and read it. And you know, anyway, it's probably because I haven't been here that long to think that that's a really great way of,
Yeah.
you know.
No, I agree with you.
It's not the Queen's speech. It's the government asking the Queen to
that's right.
sanction it.
Yeah.
I think if she were to question it, she'd have to also question her role in this British Empire, wouldn't she? So
exactly. So why call it the Queen's speech? It's the government speech that, you know, the government asked the Queen to speak. And that it's very interesting, the monarchy over here, and how that brings a whole other set of, you know.
But this brings me back to what you're talking about there, brings me back to that example that I gave earlier about the women's networking group in a corporate organization.
Yeah.
It's this kind of initiative-itis treatment of the issue when in fact it's systemic.
That's right.
And you cannot solve the system issue by some initiatives.
That's true. But then this is where you come up against this piece, which we're up against all the time in our work, which is that until people recognize that things like racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, the class system are systemic, they're not mainly based upon individual acts of discrimination. In fact, the individual acts of discrimination are kind of the surface dusting on a kind of subterranean reality, a system that kind of builds from the ground up. So for me, that's true of our world, but it's not a truth that's accepted. It's highly contested.
Yeah. And
so to do our work, to persuade people that, particularly around race, it gets really, really tricky. And I think Robin DiAngelo is quite good on this, because she just kind of keeps saying to people, this is not about whether you're a good person. This is not about whether you like Black people. This is not about whether you got a Black friend or a Black wife or a Black whatever, she says to white people. This is about a system that systematically privileges whiteness and makes whiteness supreme over any other color in the human race. And so that people find really, really difficult to swallow. They don't like that group reality. And that's partly because we've got individualism gone mad in the West. We think everything's individual, we make individual decisions, and we are individual and we are unique. So nobody likes to think they behave in exactly the same as 200 other white people who just said the same thing to me over my whole lifetime. They don't like to see that they're actually a group, and they don't know they're a group, and the fact they don't know they're a group is part of the problem. So these very, very contested truths, they are they're not absolute truths, but they are real experiences that real people really have. So this is the contested ground of diversity, which is to take it, not to take away from, it is important to be kind, and it's important not to discriminate against people. It's important not to be biased against them. That's really fundamental. But that is not going to, in itself, is not going to solve the problem of racism, sexism, and heterosexism. It's going to help. And on an interpersonal level, it's great. It's really nice to interact with someone who doesn't make biased assumptions about you. But that doesn't take away their privilege or your disadvantage in the wider world. And to work together to dismantle that's a big task.
And actually, by accident, Razia, that was a brilliant sum up of the conversation we had.
Oh, nothing happens by accident.
And so
that's true.
With the 2 minutes that we've got left, could we please just take 30 to 40 seconds of silence and just personal reflection, thinking about what we've talked about, what we've heard, what we've thought over the last hour and a bit, and have a think about just one small or big thing that you're going to do differently about diversity as a result of this session. Right, anybody happy to share to kick off?
I can kick off. So what I've realized over the last couple of years is that I've spent a huge amount of time learning learning a lot of different things. But it makes me really want to say, okay, I can learn about all this stuff, but where I really need the help is in how I put things into action and how I put, you know, the information that Rosie and Louisa have given us today into more action.
What does the first step look like, Kim?
Well, probably reaching out to Louisa or Razia and asking the question.
Okay.
Maybe they might even be kind enough to give us some ideas now.
Okay, well,
Or I don't know. Oh, we're
I want to be
we're
respectful
past
of time.
time.
Yeah, we're over
Well,
time.
So
I'll put you in touch
Yep.
with each other so that you can take
great. That would be great.
Louisa, what about you?
I think something that Razia said about when you're in conflict with somebody, trying to connect with them to find that
Going up
when
and
you,
down the ladder, was it? That
yeah, going up and down the ladder to meet them so you get that connection. I think I need to do more of that. Because sometimes it can get triggering when you're having these conversations. So and it's not about right and wrong. I know all of that, but I need to get a little bit deeper to understand that connection, I think.
Okay. Razia?
I think mine is almost the opposite to yours, Louisa, which is when I get triggered, I think I need to learn to walk away from situations, because actually what I tend to do, because I intellectually, I understand what's going on and I try and intellectualize my way out of it by engaging in a discussion or a dialogue. Actually, what I need to do is to move out of the situation until I come back to regulation and then find a way to connect with the person later on.
Yeah.
Then I can come to them more integrated in myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because otherwise I just sort of pummel them with intellectual superiority, and that doesn't really, it's not really very good. It doesn't actually help the relationship. It makes me feel better for a moment, but it doesn't build relationship.
Didn't mean not wanting to talk to you again, Razia.
I don't think I've ever done that to you, Louisa, because I don't think anything you've ever done has put me in a dysregulated state.
And I'm so glad.
I
So
think
mine-
that's super important. Yeah.
Mine is about the, it's kind of driven out of realizing that we're all in our little bubbles. And that's to our detriment, that we don't understand actually what's happening in other people's bubbles. So there's a couple of people that I'm connected with. One is a guy in Nigeria who does values stuff with school kids. And the other is an educationalist in Brazil, and she runs a virtual exchange program for schools so that pupils in one school can get together with pupils in another school and they can understand the differences. And so I'm going to put the two of them together, because I think that for her to introduce some of the people she knows in schools in more privileged places with those schools that the guy deals with in Nigeria would help them to understand each other enormously.
Right.
So that brings us to the end of this diversity values jam. It's been a stimulating conversation, really thought-provoking. I didn't think that it would be any less. I think we did speak a bit more about politics and religion than I was expecting to, but that was all good too. Razia, thank you so much for
You're very welcome.
the introduction and keeping the theme through. And thank you very much, everybody else, for attending today.
And thank you guys for sticking with me on my travel journeys.
Oh,
Thanks,
no
Vanessa.
worries. Lovely to meet you, Kim.
You
All right.
too. You
Take
too.
care.